the kind invitation, and I'm delighted to be here. Giving a talk on Spinoza in this forum is something special, and I'm, just looking at some of the last names like Ergas, the participants. I mean, it's very moving. I'm going to give a talk which I haven't written yet, but I've presented it three times, I think, before. And you will see that my conclusions so far are pretty tentative. Now, the plan is I'll try to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A, questions and answers. And I'd be happy also to answer if you have any questions regarding the more recent events. But the title, of course, the title of the talk may seem to you bizarre. Wasn't Spinoza excommunicated? Well, it's a small provocation on my side. I think that what I would argue is that what happened there is something else. It's not precisely excommunication. I'll explain what it is in a second. But let me say a few words just about Spinoza himself before we delve into the question of what happened in that evening in which Spinoza was put on Herem. So briefly, I don't think I need to add much to that, but Benedict de Spinoza was one of the greatest philosophers of all times, perhaps the greatest metaphysician of all times. And what we're going to do today, we are just going to zoom in on one episode, a ban or a Herem that was pronounced by the lay leaders of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam in July 1656. Now, I would not elaborate now on the converso background because I think that in this forum, this is somewhat redundant, right? I mean, that's precisely something that I'm sure you'll know probably much better than me. So the double sense of the title that I gave here, it would be basically, is the following. I mean, on the one hand, what I'll explain is that Herem is not precisely an excommunication. Secondly, I will also argue that many of the theories that have been suggested so far for the reason on the Herem, for the Herem on Spinoza, are, to my mind, very unconvincing. So I will try to explain why I think that much of the story behind it is basically just a myth. Now, I do have some ideas about the possibilities or what could have been the reason for that, but right now it's merely a speculation, and I'll explain why I think so. So, oops. Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, so the plan is the following. First of all, we'll speak about a Herem versus excommunication. I'll try to explain why I think that there is a significant difference between these two notions. In the second part, we'll go through just the common public legend about Spinoza's so-called excommunication, right? And we'll see some features of that. In part three, we will look closely at the actual text of the Herem on Spinoza. And in part four, I'll explain what are the unlikely reasons for the Herem. I'll basically address three leading theories or attempts to explain the reasons for the Herem. The final point, the final section, I'll point out that Spinoza himself thought that excommunication is a perfectly legitimate tool of the church. So he doesn't have a problem with that. I'll show it and explain that. And one question which we might wish to ask is, was he right? Right? So we'll address that at the very end. At the very end of the very end, I will also suggest or perhaps gesture at some directions at what could have triggered the Herem on Spinoza. Okay, so we have plenty of work to do. I'll try to work as fast as I can so that we'll have plenty of time also for discussion and responses to your questions. So let's see. The concept of and practice of Herem has been poorly studied so far. there are hardly any studies of the development of the concept of Herem in rabbinic writing. And with the exceptions of Yosef Kaplan's excellent work on the practice of Herem in early modern Amsterdam, we know very little about how rabbinic theorizing of Herem has been applied in various historical contexts. So personally, I'm now involved in editing a collection of essays on the history of Herem because it is a notion that when you look at how it was practiced in different communities, it's very, very difficult to establish a clear pattern. Just to give you, if you wish, an example of that. So if you look at the Cairo Gniza, which is supposed to have documents of Jewish life for something like 1900 years, there are very few, if any, documents of Herem there. And the question is why? So was the Cairo community so special, so unique? Or perhaps there is something much more complex about the issue of Herem. I can tell you right now that Amsterdam is the world capital of the announcements of Herem, both in space and in time. I mean, there are few communities that can compete with Amsterdam, 17th century Amsterdam, in terms of the frequency of Herems. And of course, the reasons are pretty clear. I mean, it's a new community, on the one hand, trying to establish boundaries, on the other hand, a very self-confident community. And the result of the combination of this self-confidence on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to set straight boundaries is likely to trigger something like an easy attitude towards announcing Herem. Let me add more that when I'm saying that there is a problematic situation in terms of just this serious scholarship on Herem, the situation is far worse in English. So many of the scholars who recently wrote on this issue seem to have no access to rabbinic sources. And the fact is that currently the best source for the study of Herem is an entry in the Encyclopedia Talmudica. It's 25 pages long. It's a good source. It's still not perfect. I mean, we would need much more substantial work in order to be able to tell something more serious than what is there. But when people are writing about Herem without consulting this entry in the Encyclopedia Talmudic, it's a problem, because what we are likely to have as a result is very shallow generalizations and work that is very imprecise. Okay. So the first question which I would like to raise is just simply, is it legitimate to translate Herem as excommunication? And let me raise a few preliminary doubts. For the purpose of simplicity, I will just suggest a comparison between excommunication as practiced in Roman Catholicism and rabbinic practices, although, again, of course, excommunication is present also in Protestant denominations as well. And again, just to stress the complexity, that the practice of Herem in rabbinic Judaism itself varies considerably from one place to another. So I'll try to spell out as much as I can some common features, and I'll explain where these features are actually not so much universally upheld. Okay, so let's just have a very simple and quick comparison. So the essential effect of excommunication in Catholicism is withdrawal of sacraments. Now, since in rabbinic Judaism you don't really have sacraments, there is nothing remotely similar in Herem. Even not burial. I mean, Herem does not necessarily involve rejection of burial in a Jewish cemetery, and so the sacraments that are supposed to be the essential feature of excommunication are not really relevant in the Jewish context. Excommunication in Catholicism usually does not require social isolation. It's withdrawal of sacraments. Herem does. I mean, usually Herem requires not being in a distance of 4 Daled Amot of 4 or 2 meters or something like that. Thirdly, excommunication must be issued by a church by a church authority, either the bishop or specifically the Bishop of Rome, right, the Pope. Herem was frequently, again, I don't want to generalize to say mostly, but in many cases, it was issued by the lay leaders. We know that this was also the custom in Amsterdam in the 17th century. And the nice episode that we also know is that when Menashe ben Israel tried to challenge this practice and claim that their responsibility and the authority to announce Herem should be given to rabbis, the result was that Menashe ben Israel himself was put on Herem. After a day, he withdrew from his strong claim, and then the Herem was lifted and he went back to the community. So the rabbis, again, in the case of Amsterdam at least, the rabbis were not the people who would announce the Herem. Now, moreover, Herem within the rabbinic context can be reflexive. A person can put himself under Herem. By contrast, there is no self-excommunication. Simply, it's just not there. Fifth, the rejection of dogma or principle of faith is the common reason of excommunication. Rejection of dogma was rarely, it happened, but it was not a very common reason for Herem. And in that case, and Amsterdam is not such an exception. We just have the list of the Herems that were announced around Spinoza's time, the vast majority of which are related to much more concrete actions, meaning when someone is going to an Ashkenazi butcher and purchasing a meat not from a Sephardic koshering system, he would be put on Herem. People would be put on Herem for going back to Spain. There are few cases, even in Amsterdam, of Herem for just mere beliefs. They are rare. I mean, I don't want to say that they never occur, but they are really rare. Okay. Now, oops, I cannot see. Sorry, I simply cannot. I'm sorry. So excommunication usually is universal. I mean, especially of course when the Pope announced an excommunication, it is valid. I mean, once the Popes announce it, I mean, it is universally valid. There is nothing of that sort in the context of Herem. So Herems usually are, not there is nothing, but it's usually they are much more local, or they require the acceptance of local rabbis in different places in order for the Herem to be valid. So much so that we know, for example, about another important figure that was put on Herem, again in Amsterdam, by the Sephardic community at the end of the 17th or early 18th century, and that's the Chacham Tzvi, who was the rabbi of the Ashkenazi community. He was put on Herem, and he had to leave Amsterdam because of that. That does not mean that he was put on Herem anywhere else, right? I mean, he became the most important rabbinic authority in Europe shortly afterwards. So again, being put on Herem in Amsterdam does not mean that you are outside of the community, of the entire Jewish community. It's much, Herems in this sense are usually much more local. So having noted these differences, we should not deny some similarities between Herem and excommunication. Of course, there are tools for imposing some sort of unity of practice, I would say usually. Moreover, it is quite likely that Herem was described as a form of a Jewish excommunication in communities of ex-Marranos. I mean, I haven't seen these documents, but I won't be surprised if we find these documents where there are references to Herem as Jewish excommunication. Still, I would argue Herem and excommunication are first or second cousins. They are not twin siblings. And therefore, we should not associate too closely the two in order not to mislead scholars not familiar with the characteristics of Herem. Meaning, many of the features that we will normally associate with excommunication are simply not going to work with Herem. Let me... Sorry, I'm trying to move there. Okay. So the narratives, so I'm sorry, let me, having noted thus that Spinoza was put on Herem rather than being excommunicated, let me turn now to discuss some unlikely reasons for the Herem. So first of all, let's see what is the common myth, right? I mean, and I'll share it with you, and then we'll go to the document of the Herem itself. So during the 18th and 19th century, the story of Spinoza's so-called excommunication was frequently cited by European writers as a proof of the cultural inferiority and backwardness of the Jews. So here's just a simple example from Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. Yeah, I'm quoting from Hegel. He's saying, in his youth, Spinoza was instructed by the rabbis of the synagogues to which he belonged, but he soon fell put with them, their wrath having been unkindled by the criticism which he has passed on the fantastic doctrines of the Talmud. The rabbi offered him a yearly allowance of 1,000 gilded if he would keep away from the synagogue and hold his tongue, etc. But basically, I'm not going to read the entire quote, but what you can see here is that the idea is there are some primitive and fantastic doctrines of the Talmud. Spinoza challenged them, therefore he was put on Herem. Interestingly, it's not, Hegel does not think that he was put on Herem because of disbelief in life eternal, in mind eternity or life after death or etc. Just some fantastic doctrines of the Talmud. We can discuss to what extent Spinoza was critical of the Talmud. I think the story is complex. I mean, he is, but is much less than you would think, actually, when you start looking at the theological political treatise. But I'll put that aside. I mean, if someone wishes to raise that in the Q&A, I'll be very happy to address this issue. So, for the Europeans in the 18th and 19th century, I mean, then the story of Spinoza was a kind of a proof of the backwardness of the Jews, right? Now, more recently, we have some two historical plays which retell the story of Spinoza's excommunication while attempting to downplay the anti-Semitic moral of the tale. I'm interested specifically in plays because I'm interested in the wide public perception of Spinoza. So I'll put aside for a minute, I'm putting aside just the scholarly discussion of Spinoza's life. Sorry. So there is an interesting Israeli play by Yoshua Solo, which charges the rabbis, rather than the Jews in general, with fanaticism and intolerance. I'm not sure it was translated into English, but we'll say a few words about this play in a minute. And David Yves, New Jerusalem, I think perhaps a better play, just which was staged about slightly more than 10 years ago, places the guilt on the Amsterdam city authorities, who are described as pressing the Jewish community to cast out the damned heretic. Now, the narratives of both plays are highly ideological and have much more to do with the political reality of the playwrights than with that of Spinoza. But if we wish to try to understand what is the core of the popular narrative, I think you'll see it in both places, for example, is that Spinoza was excommunicated or was banned by the rabbis due to his heretical espousal of atheism and pantheism. Sometimes there is a kind of unclarity between what was really his opinion. Was he an atheist or a pantheist? And his denial of the eternity of the human mind. I think you'll find all of these elements in both plays. Again, I would argue that if you look at the plays, I mean, there are far more attesting to the mindset and the ideology, and that's perfectly fine, of the authors of these plays than to anything related to the historical facts. So what are the historical facts? We have one major text, and that's a text of the Herem itself. And let's just try to scrutinize it quickly, and we'll read it together and see what we can get out of it. So the text is nice and explicit in saying the seniores of the Mahmud, having known the evil opinions and acts of Baruch de Spinoza, pay attention that there is here, we are referring to both opinions and acts. Right? It's an important, I think, element. They have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways, but having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught. So again, we have evidence that he is teaching this, and about his monstrous deeds. So it's not only doctrines, but also some actions. And having for these numerous trustworthy witnesses who have deposed and borne witness to this effect in the presence of the said Spinoza, they became convinced of the truth of this matter. And after all this has been investigated in the presence of the honorable Chachamim, they have decided, meaning not the Chachamim, but the seniors of the Mahmud, with their consent, meaning with the consent of the rabbis, that the said Spinoza would be placed under Herem and separated from the nation of Israel. Okay, that's the first half of the Herem, and then comes the second half, which is basically a formula that is trying to frighten the person. I mean, it's as we're going to see in half a minute. It seems pretty harsh. It's actually much less harsh than you would think, and I'll explain in half a second why. But let's read, just because in order to get to the juiciness of the text. You say, so the second half is basically the act of the magical act of enacting the Herem, saying by decree of the angels and by command of the holy man, we excommunicate. Pay attention to what is happening. They are using, I mean, of course, all the text is in Portuguese, but what instead of using the Portuguese word for excommunication, they are taking the word Herem and just declining it as if it is a Portuguese word. So we emheramamos. So it's almost like a Yiddish Portuguese, if you wish. Expel, curse, and ban Baruch de Spinoza with the consent of God, blessed be, and with the consent of the entirely holy congregation, and in front of these holy scrolls with the 1613 precepts which are written therein, cursing with the excommunication with which Joshua banned Jericho, and with the curse which Elisha cursed the boys, and with all the castigations which are written in the book of the law. Cursed he be, and cursed he be by night, cursed he be by day, and cursed he be by night, cursed he be when he lies down, cursed he be when he rises up. You can continue reading. I mean, a very juicy text. I mean, on the face of it, it seems to be, pretty impressive. I'm not so sure about it. So let's try to look at some of the things that we know about the Herem. So the Herem was announced on the 6th day of Av, 1656, which begins on Wednesday, July 26th, and is mostly on Thursday, July 27th. It is unlikely that the Herem was pronounced at night, because that would mean that it would, I assume that in Amsterdam, the night begins in July, something around 10 or 10:30 at night. So having this ceremony at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night would be something I think would be pretty unusual, or we should have some testimony that it was carried out late at night, and we have nothing of that sort. So I think it's pretty secure to say that the ceremony happened on Thursday, July 27th. So the Herem was announced by the lay leaders, not the rabbis, not the court. Actually, it is an important issue because, or perhaps an important issue because I know that some members of the community today, and even before that, 40, 50 years ago, raised the possibility of lifting the Herem. And one response which was suggested by the rabbi of Hag, I think about 50 years ago, was that you cannot lift the Herem because you cannot change an act of a Beit Din, of a rabbinic court, unless the correction is made by a court which is more important than the original court. And out of respect for the original court, you are not going to announce your own court as being more important. The issue here is that technically, the Herem was not, as far as we know, the Herem was not announced by the Beit Din. It was announced by the lay leaders. And perhaps there is some direction to have a Herem by the Beit Din of Amsterdam, but we have no documents of that sort or attesting to that. So in the technical sense, the issue of not challenging an induction by previous rabbinic court does not seem to be relevant in this case. Now, the reason for the Herem, and that's actually the most important thing for me at least, the reason for the Herem was a combination of monstrous deeds and abominable heresies. So it should be both of them in some way. And we also learned that Spinoza taught his abominable heresies. So you can see also why the anxiety about spreading these views. Now, another interesting feature is that the nature of the deeds and heresies is not spelled out in the document. And in fact, till this very day, I don't think we know it. More than 350 years after that, it's quite astonishing that we have, I think, barely a clue about what were these abominable heresies and horrible deeds. So now, let me go to one more interesting point. So some scholars were highly impressed by the severity of the text rhetoric of the second half of the text, where you have this magical formula of curses, etc. So let me just quote, for example, my friend and colleague, Stephen Adler, is saying, Motora received the appropriate text from Venice chief rabbi, his former teacher, Leon Modena. Modena, in turn, had adopted it from the late 13th century compendium of Jewish law and custom, the Kolbo. Modena cobbled together a document full of curses and imprecations, one malediction after another. As far as we know, Modena's elaborate composition was brought out in the 17th century only for the banning of Spinoza. The problem is that there was nothing in this text that was a composition of Modena. Every single line in the formula of the ban of the Helm and Spinoza is adopted from the text of the Kolbo. Moreover, if any of you have a look at the text of the Kolbo, you see that the magical formula of the text of the Kolbo is 20 times longer than the one that was used against Spinoza. So whatever number of maledictions that Spinoza got, the full version, which is spelled out throughout in detail in Kolbo, is far, far longer. Okay. Now, by now, I think we already know the author of the Kolbo. It's Rabbi Aaron. I'm blanking now about where he's from, but we know, I think, by now who is the author of the Kolbo, although the history of the composition of this formula is absolutely unclear. We know that at the end of the Kolbo, there is an amalgamate of texts that somehow are almost thrown there, and we know very little about why are they coming there precisely in this place. But what we don't have is any kind of good history of the development of the formula of the Herem. We simply don't. We are not even close to having anything like that. Okay. So what other sources do we have about the Herem? So we have the testimonies of two Spanish visitors to Amsterdam, Brother Thomas Salerno y Roberes, Captain Miguel Perez de Maltranilla. Before the Inquisition in Madrid, they visit Amsterdam, then they return to Madrid, and before the Inquisition, they're giving the position, just describing whatever they've seen in Amsterdam. Part of this is position. In part of this testimony, they're saying Spinoza and Juan de Predo observed the Jewish law. They changed their opinion once they realized that the law is not true, that the soul dies with the body, and that God does not exist, but only philosophically. Now, what does it mean God does not exist, but only philosophically? We'll discuss in half a second. And that is why they have been expelled from the synagogue. Should we trust this testimony? I think we should, but only to a limited degree. Why? Because neither the monk nor the captain is a philosopher, and it is highly unlikely that they could be trusted to discern any philosophical subtleties. So when they're saying that Spinoza, a philosopher, who is a philosopher, is saying that God exists but only philosophically, what does it mean? I mean, existing philosophically seems to be pretty important, right? Especially when it comes from the mouth of a philosopher. Spinoza's anti-anthropomorphic conception of God would most likely appear to the vulgar as denying the existence of God, just as Maimonides' conception of God appeared to some readers as esoterically denying the existence of God. I mean, if you're wishing to look at the readers who read Maimonides as an atheist, I mean, I'd be happy to refer you to that. I mean, Leo Strauss is one example, but I can tell you there are many more than that. So to that, for this reason, I'm saying, well, we should take this testimony seriously, but on the other hand, with a certain degree of suspicion. Okay, so here are the most common explanations that have been suggested so far for the Herem on Spinoza. I should be done in 5 minutes, I hope. So the first explanation, is pantheism. It's what you find in Sobol, in popular imagination. While pantheism or panentheism was widely perceived as a dangerous heresy in the early modern Latin West, it did not have that reputation in the rabbinic context. So, and what I'm doing here, I'm trying to explain why I think this explanation does not work. The mainstream of the Kabbalah is thoroughly panentheistic, and in fact, if you look at Spinoza's own teachers in the Amsterdam community, whether it's Abu Av or Shaul Mortera, many of them, they affirm variants of panentheism. I can show you very easily just looking at these texts. So again, I'll be happy to elaborate on these issues if there are any questions, but panentheism has a very different status within the rabbinic context than what you find in Western Christianity in medieval and early modern Europe. Another suggestion was Cartesianism. So according to Kasher and Biderman, Spinoza was excommunicated because he has been interested in Cartesian philosophy and expressed this philosophical inclination in public. Okay. Why doesn't it work? Well, there are many reasons. So let's begin. Descartes himself, Descartes' view on God and religion are actually quite conservative. I think that anyone who would read Descartes' views about God, you'll see that he's far more conservative, for example, than Maimonides. The few issues that raise the suspicion of the church about Descartes are simply irrelevant in the Jewish context, because the main issue in terms of the tension between the Cartesians and the Catholic Church were whether Cartesian physics allow for transubstantiation. Well, transubstantiation is not a wholly Jewish doctrine. So Cartesianism in itself does not seem to be a threat to Judaism. And in fact, I think that we will find rabbis in the 17th century, in the early 18th century, very openly espousing Cartesianism. Now, more than that, when you look at Spinoza's own writing, you see that Spinoza is strongly anti-Cartesian from his very early period. Indeed, he would frequently describe Cartesian views as representing the style of thinking of the vulgus, right? In the very first letter we have of Spinoza from 1661, Spinoza is asked by Henry Oldenburg, the secretary of the Royal Society in England, to explain to him what blemishes does he find in the writings of Descartes. And Spinoza is saying, okay, you know, it's not my custom to speak bad about other figures, but if you ask, he says, Descartes is a great philosopher, but he has a bad understanding of the nature of the human mind, bad understanding of the cause of all things, and a bad understanding of the cause of human error. So it's basically something like, he's a great philosopher, just bad metaphysics, bad philosophy of mind, and bad epistemology. And when Spinoza is saying that, he is what? He is 20, so 61, he's 29 years old, right? He's almost no one, but that's him. That's the kind of, I mean, he's pretty open about these issues. Let's go back to to Kasher and Biederman's speculation. So Kasher and Biederman pointed to the history of bans against the study of philosophy as partial support for their view. Now, we know that in the 13th century, they were following the publication, or not publication, but the writing of the Guide of the Perplexed. There were some bans that were announced against the study of philosophy in Spain, in other places, in Provençal. We will speak about it in half a second. However, neither Mortera nor Aboab seems to share this attitude towards philosophy. So we have the list of Aboab's library. It includes the works of Aristotle, Averroes, Ibn Ezra, Maimonides' Guide, and Gersonides' Words of the Lord. So he's not a person who does not read philosophy. So simply making him the kind of rabbi who is not willing to engage with philosophy is simply nonsense. In addition, we would like to note that the ban against, in the 13th century, just as there was a ban against the study of philosophy, there was an opposite ban. We call it in Hebrew an Adraba Herem, or Herem Adraba, in which which bans all those who are not willing to study philosophy. So, the verdict on the study of philosophy was open. I mean, there was a fight about that, and there were bans that were announced, at least as a kind of a public issue. Whether there was any specific person who was banned because of that, as far as we know, there was none. But again, I just want to say that with some hesitation, I'm not aware, and speaking with some of the scholars who worked on that, I mean, no one brought to my attention any case of a specific person who was banned because of this issue. The kind of bans that were just warnings against the study of philosophy or against the banning of the study of philosophy. And then they came with an announcement, if you don't obey our order, you will be banned. So, but the actual ban at the end of the story, as far as we know, was not issued. So here's the third explanation. The third explanation suggested by Stephen Adler, and he suggests that Spinoza was banned because of denial of immortality. I think it's a better hypothesis among the three that we discuss here, because first of all, it is supported by this testimony of two Spaniards who came to the Inquisition and gave the deposition before the Inquisition. Still, I think it's very unlikely to be true. Why? Well, first of all, the view that you find in major medieval rabbinic figures, especially Maimonides, Gersonides, and their disciples, had very orthodox views about immortality. Over the centuries, the Maimonidean Averroist view of the soul as originating from the agent intellect or even from God and blending back in its heavenly source after death, drifted into the mainstream. So I think that if you look at the inscriptions today on many Jewish tombstones, Teh Nishmato Tzura B'Tzrua Chaim, that's actually a continuation of the idea that comes eventually from Averroes. Now, Spinoza himself developed a variant of this Averroesian view already in his early period. So it would be very odd that a view which perhaps was controversial, but was all over medieval philosophy, just literally all over medieval philosophy, would be a reason for excommunication, because there were, you're not going to excommunicate Maimonides because of that, but that was his view. In addition, I would say that bans related to mere dogma are not common in the rabbinic context. Again, I cannot rule out this possibility, but it's not common. And perhaps the most convincing argument is that the immortality hypothesis provides no explanation of the monstrous deeds, right? Remember that we've seen the text of the Herem, and it refers to some monstrous deeds. So what are they? How these monstrous deeds are supposed to be related to denial of immortality? What would be the deed that was related to denial of immortality? Okay. I'll try to finish in 3 minutes. So I promised you at the very beginning of my talk that I'll show you that Spinoza himself thinks that Herem is perfectly legitimate. So let me just fulfill this promise. So a text that appears in the chapter 19 of the Theological Political Treatise refers to the kind of functions that are the typical functions of the church. So let me read that in saying, without the authority or permission of the supreme powers, the sovereign, no one has the right and power to administer these things, namely sacred matters. And then Spinoza is giving the list of the legitimate functions of the church: to choose ministries, to determine and stabilize the foundation of the church and its teaching, to judge concerning morals and acts of piety, to excommunicate someone from or receive someone into the church, or finally, to provide for the poor. So for Spinoza, excommunication is one of the basic and perfectly legitimate functions of the church, just like almsgiving or providing for the poor. In a well-run state, in Spinoza's ideal church, the church should be subordinated to political authorities. And Spinoza is a strict Erastian. He is not supporting separation of church of state. He thinks that the state should rule and govern the church. But excommunication is still part of the fabric of the well-run state, meaning it still is going to be, in Spinoza's own state, it's going to be part of the legitimate functions of the church. Was Spinoza right? Well, again, I think that today bans and harems seem to us horrible, and for many, I think in many cases they were horrible. A ban and harem is a violent tool, and that's first of what we should recognize about it. But if we are not pacifists, we should be willing to think about how it compares with other violent measures that we are using today. Now, sometimes bans or excommunications were used in a positive manner. So, give you an example, excommunication was an important tool in the enforcement of the prohibition of polygamy in the history of Catholicism. And in the 19th century, it was a very important tool in terms of prohibiting participation in duels. Now, in our times, bans, boycotts were used positively and responsibly in the fight against South African apartheid and in the attempt to counter the power of the tobacco and gun industries. Usually, today within Orthodox communities, harems are used in order to deal with husbands that are not willing to give a divorce to their spouses. And again, I think, for my side, I think that this kind of harem is perfectly legitimate. What we shouldn't, at least, again, what my view is that a ban is a semi-violent, or I would say, why semi? It's a violent political tool. It is powerful and subject to abuse, just like any other political measure. in some forms, the politically sanctioned practice of banning or public shaming may perhaps be useful as an alternative to incarceration. So, so just like every violent political tool, it should be treated in a very, very delicate and cautious manner. It is possible, I would say even likely, that the community in Amsterdam was a bit too easy in terms of issuing bans or haramot on many people around. With regard to the last question, why was Spinoza excommunicated? I will, because we are almost run out of time, so I'll keep my pet theory just for the Q&A discussion. All I can tell you is that right now we still simply don't have the documents that are needed in order to establish this point. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. May I ask a perhaps subversive question, because you're looking at this as a philosopher, perhaps from the perspective of inside the community. I mean, did the Mahmud care that much about philosophy, or were they more concerned about their own control? First of all, I'm wondering if that's a sort of monstrous deed, a poor person not doing what they're told. Also, I'm wondering if they were basically thinking like Catholics, even though obviously they were public Jews. And thirdly, just to sort of throw into the mix, I mean, my understanding is that the Ashkenazi world had secular leadership until the overthrow of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the destruction of the Council of the Four Lands. So perhaps it wasn't that unusual to have the secular leadership passing the judgment.
Okay, so 3 questions. I mean, first of all, in terms of there was the secular leadership also in the Ashkenazi world, and that's why I think that this kind of fights about the leadership are just typical of many Jewish communities. That's simply in the case of the Amsterdam community, we have this beautiful instance of Menashe ben Israel saying, no, it is our prerogative, the rabbis, to do that, and the issue is closed in a typical Amsterdam way, put on Herem, resorts, end of story, right? So that's why I had this temptation. Is it possible that the leadership was still thinking like Catholics? It's possible. Again, there are many elements that you find among the doctrines that are going around in the 17th century, in 17th century Amsterdam, that are sometimes Christian doctrines. So, for example, you will have figures defending their eternal damnation. How common is eternal damnation within rabbinic sources? Not very much. So you have that. I mean, but again, I can tell you as that. We are missing documents. We are missing crucial documents. And there is a document that was found about 20 years ago by Oded Blessing. And I think this document should be relevant to what happened. So the document, just to spell it as quickly, the document found that basically 2 months before the Herem on Spinoza, 2 or 3 months, Spinoza petitioned the municipality of Amsterdam with a request to announce him, to recognize him as an orphan, so that he would not have to pay the debts of his father. If he had to pay the debts of his father, he would be bankrupt for the rest of his life. Dr. Blessing had some idea that this might be the reason for the excommunication. This might explain the excommunication, the Herem, because this might be an act of disrespect towards the father. I share her view that this document might be really important. I'm not sure that disrespect toward the father is such a reason for Herem. What is much more common, and we know it because we have hundreds of instances of that, is that within many communities, when someone is approaching the non-Jewish courts, instead of going to court within the Jewish community, he is considered to be breaking the autonomy of the community, and then a lot of times, and we have many examples of that, then he can be put on Herem, something like that. So if what happened was that Spinoza decided to bypass the internal rabbinic court of the community and instead go to the Amsterdam municipality in order to lift the burden of the debts that was on him. It could have been. We have many examples of similar acts triggering Herem. This being said, it's on my side, I can tell you it's still just a speculation because I want to see documents. Yeah.
Thank you. Ton.
There was a question about the word obras, and you translate that with acts, but it could also mean works.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe Spinoza had published yet by 1656, at least not in print. But could it be that there were manuscripts floating around from his hand?
It can be. We have some early testimony about an apology that he wrote. So that's also can be a possibility, yes.
Great, thank you. Ali, you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Yitzhak, for a very enlightening and fascinating talk. My question is this: is there any value from a historical comparison perspective of comparing what happened to Spinoza with what happened not that long earlier to Uriel da Costa, who was obviously a much less important philosopher, but who also suffered a very violent herem? And, could there be, I'm just speculating here, could there be an element of sort of moral panic in the Portuguese Jewish community, that suddenly you have the sort of two philosophers coming up with different ideas or potentially heretical ideas so soon after each other, and that this was somehow could lead, be the thin end of the wedge?
Right. So the connection between Spinoza and Uriel da Costa was made many times over the past three and a half centuries. I have to tell you that I'm not in a position to answer it in a definite manner either way, because to my mind we still don't really know much about what happened, what was the reason in the case of Spinoza. In the case of Uriel da Costa, the reason is, I think, pretty much known. And Uriel da Costa, in a way, wanted to, he returned to Judaism, but it was it was a different, he imagined a religion that did not exist. And so he wanted a religion that will be purely based on the Bible in a way. And, and their community basically told him, sorry, we are the wrong authority for that. This is not our religion. Was there a need for all the ceremonies of abuse of that person? Probably not. But I do understand the community in the sense that the community wished to define what they are. They are not a Karaite community, and that was something that I can understand where it comes from.
Thank you. Bernard, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Yitzhak. That was fascinating. And I feel that I have at least a slightly better knowledge of what a herem is, particularly compared with an excommunication. I'm rather proud of Spinoza, since we share an ancestor. His 6th great-grandfather was my 16th great-grandfather. From the little I know about him, I am pleased to be associated, but I have a very specific question, and it is whether you yourself, or whether you know of anybody else who has investigated whether there were personal animosities towards him, because the publication of a herem which contains absolutely no concrete facts, but simply uses words like horrendous and horrific and deeds, and talks about monstrosities, is basically a carte blanche to anybody who he had had a disagreement with, or who was jealous of him, or whose wife may have been over friendly with him, or to whom he owed money, or even more importantly, who might have owed money to him. And I wondered whether there has been any investigation of that, because open-ended laws which allow people to make claims that can then be carried out as legal actions without any kind of proof seem to me to be the ideal tool for personal revenge or animosity.
I don't know. I mean, I know that right now Jonathan Israel is working on a well-researched and biography of Spinoza, and he's digging more and more manuscripts and documents. And so I would be I'd be delighted to learn about what we know about, for example, the economical entrepreneurship of Spinoza after the death of his father and stuff of that sort. We do know that, well, the text of the Herem refers to some sort of investigation that was carried out. And because Spinoza was not an underdog, I mean, Spinoza came from their relatively strong families in the community, perhaps not the strongest, but still pretty strong. So I tend to agree with someone like Yosef Kaplan, who is saying there should have been something there that in order for this kind of issue to develop seriously, because you don't go against a leading member of the community, and Spinoza's father was a leading member of the community without strong reasons to do that. But this being, again, all this being said, I myself, I can tell you, I don't know. I mean, we need to have more and more documents, and that's these documents might be right now sitting somewhere. I mean, ask Tom. I mean, he knows these documents probably more than any living being. So he will tell you just where are they supposed to be, and we need to just unearth them.
Thank you.
Well, there's a lot in Amsterdam. Among other things, court cases have not been studied very well because they are vast. And I would think that business deals would have been dealt with by the commissaris of the small affairs, commissarissen van de kleine zaken. But I don't know if they are still there from that period. And I also think that in minibooks from the burgemeesters and schepenen, there might still be material which could be useful for you. But again, a lot of that is not digitized, and it's a lot. A typical minibook of the Amsterdam municipality authorities will be like this for 1 year. So that's a lot of reading to do, and you might have to go there in person because it's not digitized yet. And again, I don't know if they have been preserved from that period.
Thank you.
But I'm pretty sure that there must be something. I don't know about that theory of Odette of Lessing though, because Jews went to court all the time when they could not get a favorable decision by the Beit Din or by the rabbis. And they even went to the High Court to settle family disputes. And what Spinoza did was simply, abandoning the estate of his father.
Yeah.
And that happened. That also happened a lot.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's an argument that cuts wood.
One thing I can tell you is that within rabbinic law, you can go to a foreign court if you get a permission from the local rabbinic court. So now you might well be right that actually no one cared about that, and no one was basically asking for a permission and in order to. So this might be the situation. I simply, we need to know this as a matter of fact. So
yes, I myself wonder why this Herem against Spinoza wasn't signed by the full Mahmud. In the decision books of the Mahmud, you see that every decision has been signed by the full Mahmud, with few exceptions, except the Herem against Spinoza, which was an important decision, no doubt. It's not signed. We know who the Mahmud is in this period, and I wonder if somehow that doesn't make the whole Herem illegal.
Again, I mean, one thing I can tell you again is that the practice and theory, both the practice and the theory of Herem itself is quite murky. Now, usually when you have a rabbinic court act, usually the members of the court signed with their names. When it is an action of the community, I mean, is there a need for the representative of the public to sign on that? I don't know. I mean, but the point that the text was not signed is, of course, really interesting.
A question by Judith Gabay. Why are we so fascinated by Spinoza?
Oh, that's a long story. All I can say is that he's a wonderful philosopher. I mean, I think that there are very few philosophers in his caliber, and he's extremely bold, making really very few concessions to common sense. And at least in my case, I can tell you that I like philosophers that are just thinking through, and then whatever they think, they will just develop it in the most consistent manner. And I think that's philosophy at its best.
There's a question from Aya, and she is unmuted.
She's raising her hand.
Hi, thank you so much, John, David, Yitzhak. This is my first time participating in this call, and I'm very happy to be here. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to an earlier question that I had about, starting with David's question about whether they were thinking as Catholics. So the question in particular would be whether there are any sort of linguistic or textual similarities between texts of the Herem and perhaps other Inquisition texts or excommunication texts from the Catholic Church at the time. The reason why I ask this question is because I studied a little bit of Luis de Carvajal in his autobiography, and what I found there were some sounds of martyrdom texts from the Catholic Church, and I'm really asking the question about specifically about again textual borrowings. I mean, do you see any similarities, perhaps, if you have studied this, between the use of adjectives or rhetorical anything that could link these two kinds of texts?
Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, so first of all, I didn't study that, and I'm not sure anyone studied that. I think it's obvious that there should be mutual influences between Jewish and Catholic and Christian practices at the same time. This being said, we know that at least the formulaic version part of the Herem, meaning the magical part, the curses, are going back to this 13th century text of the Kolbo. What happened, how this text was generated, right? These 2 pages which you find at the end of the Kolbo, I'm not aware. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that there are, if I'm not mistaken, I think that only in the past few years people identified the author of the Kolbo. So we know roughly by now who is the person standing behind this text. How this very long compilation of curses developed, as far as I know, we have no clue.
Okay, thank you.
Frances, you have a question.
Yes, I make theatre a lot and all sorts of improvised stuff and working with all kinds of people. And I'm fascinated as to whether he actually left any notes about how he was feeling about this, what his relationships were like, how he interacted with people in the community, what happened. Because the way we're going through it is as if he's just a kind of historical figure. And he can't have been. He was obviously quite heroic, quite startlingly brilliant. And I love what you're doing, by the way. Thank you so much for all this. But can you say something about his internal conflicts?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So the place where we might have some personal, I don't want to say leftovers, but some sediments might be the theological political treatise, where Spinoza occasionally has some comments, responses about the Jewish community, and I think that in many cases it might be the case, and when he's speaking about the Pharisees, he might well be speaking about the 17th century Amsterdam. I mean, it's a long story, but Spinoza's discussion of the Pharisees is anything but historically nuanced. I mean, it's a category that goes throughout history, basically from the Talmud till the 17th century. It's just one bulk, and so there are different expressions that you find in the TTP that might be possibly responses to the Herem, but they're all, as far as I can see, they are all speculative. It is possible that if Spinoza wrote an early text, which was the apology for his Herem, he might have used parts of it in some chapters of the TTP. I know that serious Spinoza scholars are raising and supporting this view. So two specific figures I will mention in this context are Ed Curley and Warren Harvey. They have slightly different views, but both of them think that some parts of the early TTP, or the early chapters of the TTP, might come from this apology. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to rule it out, because again, there are so many things there that are unclear. So, in fact, I can only say that I think that sometimes you are surprised at the degree to which, I mean, you would expect someone who was then to be even more, or at least I tend to think that would be even more embittered and hateful but he's not. I mean, he has definitely some problems with the Jewish tradition, but he's also saying many almost admiring things about Jewish civilization. So the story is somewhat complex, to my mind.
Does he ever mention his actual feelings?
No,
never. Mm.
And again, as you see from the text I quoted at the very end, he doesn't think that excommunication is wrong.
That's right.
He basically treats it as a perfectly legitimate form or function of the church.
Mm-hmm.
In his state, in his ideal state, it seems that there will be a church, and one of the functions of the church will also be excommunicating.
Well, I suppose so. It makes sense, actually, in its way. It's logical, sort of. Thank you.
My pleasure.
There's a comment from Kevin. I don't think the members of the congregation were that religious. I used the word ambivalent. Certainly many visitors noticed and commented the fact, which is perhaps my view as well, perhaps, that maybe it was more about power than doctrine. But I mean, what do you think the real reason was?
I don't know. I mean, okay. No, but I'm saying I think power. The power is what we all. That's what human beings are. They are just striving to have power, right? I mean, so and of course, when you think that you have the power and it's a justified power, then you can even allow yourself to use this in a kind of nonchalant way and perhaps even abusive way. So there is a sense I think you get is that the leadership of this community in the 17th century is pretty arrogant. They have lots of power. They have huge amount of economic power. Now, but all this being said, again, David, I simply don't have enough documents. So yes, I suspect that there is here some sort of arrogance in terms of, but I might be absolutely wrong. I mean, because we wanted to learn and to know what really happened there. Right now, again, it's just an impression that they have.
Isn't the arrogance of the lay leaders something that was later constructed by these German philosophers who, like Spinoza, and painted him like some illuminated mind who was persecuted by those dark forces in the Amsterdam community?
Right, and again, the question is, so the question is, of course, were they dark forces? It's definitely possible they were dark forces, but we still. So what was the dark issue precisely again? Mm-hmm. I don't think. I mean, the view that you find most common, just when you look outside. I mean, if you ask a child who heard about the Herem and Spinoza, will say he was banned because he was pantheist. That's the most unlikely explanation. I cannot absolutely rule it out, but when you look at the writings of the rabbis in the community of Spinoza, they will have plenty of expressions that are becoming very, very, not very close, they are panentheistic. I mean, and within early modern Kabbalah, panentheism is just all over. I mean, some Kabbalists will say that whenever you are eating something, you are eating God, right? Another Kabbalist will tell you that every idol that you see, the idol is divine. The problem with idolatry is just that you think that the air to the right and to the left of the idol is not divine, right? So, the notions. I mean, it's not that you don't have heresy within the rabbinic context, but it's not necessarily the same doctrines which are considered to be heretical within the Christian context that are going to be heretical within the rabbinic context.
Yeah.
I see Eric Bachach wants to ask a question.
Oh, yes, I will unmute. Eric, you are unmuted. Eric, if you can speak.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we can't hear you. Oh, better.
This is nice.
I'm afraid we can't hear you clearly.
Can you hear me better now?
A little bit better.
Yeah.
It's strange. Okay. If you can't hear me say it, then I don't do my question.
Do you want to try asking your question? It's a little bit. I think I can try to get.
I don't know why he's not working. Can you hear my? Can you hear me?
Now it's better.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have a question to Professor Melamed. I thank him. I thank you all for organizing this, and it's amazing how you put your arguments together. I thank you very much for that. Very interesting. But I have a question. I have a feeling that you didn't put this philosophy in the age he lived. There was a battle, I think, politically going on in the 17th century between the church communities. I found it difficult to the Armenians and Fuchsians, the Cartesians, the people who were against Cartesians. And Spinoza was in the middle of a group of people debating about all these philosophies and creating a new philosophy. And we know that you can't hear me.
Sorry, Eric. It's very.
Okay.
Can you put your question in chat? Then we will
Leave it. Leave it.
You need to look to your right, Eric. Turn your head to the right, and then we can hear you better. Look to your right. So your voice, yes, now speak. With your head turned right.
Like this?
Yes.
Better.
Now you can hear me.
Yes.
It is really very strange, this. We didn't have this before. My question is, Spinoza in the middle of a philosophical and church battle in the 17th century.
Right.
And I have a feeling you didn't, Professor Melamed didn't put his philosophy in that battle. And we know that books of other people, and Menashe ben Yisrael, but also other people who wrote books, they had to give it before it was printed. They have to give it to the Parnasim, the leaders, yeah, who were asking people to translate the Hebrew to Portuguese, etc. Yeah, to say whether the book could be printed or not. So I have a feeling that it is not so much the Kabbalah or the Guide of the Perplexed or that kind of things, but it is more the battle that was going on between the Armenians, between the churches, and Spinoza, belonging to a group of scientists who we call philosophers, but in that time they were scientists who were doing new things that were upsetting the society. And the Parnassim had to control that, had a feeling to control this. And my question is, how do you see this Spinoza in the middle of this scientific and church battle?
Okay. So first of all, I didn't speak about Spinoza's philosophy or hardly anything that I mean, I have much interest in his metaphysics. I don't think I perhaps alluded to that once or twice, but that was not the topic of my talk. Now, was Spinoza involved in the local battles between the churches in the Netherlands? Yes, to some extent, especially in the theological political treaties. I think that now, I think that in many ways he was much more radical than probably most of the participants there. But I do think that part of this radicalism is inherited from the Guide of the Perplexed. I mean, I think that the Guide of the Perplexed is a bold text. I mean, as I'm stressing that once again, I think that when you look at the religious views of the Guide of the Perplexed in comparison, for example, to Descartes, Maimonides is far bolder in terms of his religious views about creation, about providence, about rejection of anthropomorphic thinking. And in that sense, I think that, many of his so-called libertarian friends were actually relatively much more conservative than Spinoza himself, to my mind.
Thank you. Ton.
I think we can wrap it up at this point. And say goodbye to everyone. What do you think? Just one more question. I told everyone that you will be researching a book and a documentary in Amsterdam soon. Can you tell us some more about your plans?
So I'm working on an intellectual biography of Spinoza for a Hebrew publisher, Mahon Shazar. But next to that, I'm also helping an Israeli producer and film director to make a film on the biography of Spinoza. So I'm helping them with advice, with research. And so we hope to visit Amsterdam probably in February. Of course, it depends on whether the corona situation will permit that. Mm-hmm. So assuming we can do that in a safe manner without causing any trouble to anyone, we'd be delighted to do that. If not in February, probably in March. Mm-hmm. So step by step.
And when will your book be coming out?
So the book for Shazar, I need to finish it hopefully by May or June, but I have another book that was just accepted by Oxford University Press. So hopefully they will
also
come out.
About Spinoza?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, about his metaphysics, yes. Mm-hmm. So my hope that they will appear probably next year or something like that.
David, shall I
Yes. Thank you. That was really absolutely fascinating talk, and hopefully you enjoyed speaking to the home team, as it were, from that community.
It was a special event for me. I really enjoyed that. So thank you so much.
Great. Ton, would you like to close?
We thank everyone attending this meeting, whether on Zoom or YouTube. And we thank our patrons who made this meeting possible. Without them, we will be nowhere. And a big thank you to Yitzhak Melamed for speaking with Sephardic World. And we all hope to see you